My mom disowned me for choosing a child-free life, calling it a betrayal of family values and tradition. This led to sibling tensions, financial fallout, and a fight for my peace. Up until lately, I believed my family to be close-knit, perhaps a bit too traditional. I am a 31-year-old lady. My mother was the focal point of our family while I was growing up. She is one of those women who thinks that marriage, children, and Sunday dinners with the grandchildren running around are all necessary for the ideal life. Although he is calmer and more encouraging, my dad never really challenges her. Out of the three, I am the oldest. My sister Hannah, 27, has always been the peacemaker, and my brother Adam, 29, is laid back and prefers to avoid conflict. Our family get-togethers typically followed the same pattern. Catch up, overindulge in food, and put up with my mom's insensitive inquiries about when I would settle down. I ignored it for many years. I had been concentrating on developing a fulfilling life for myself, traveling, and advancing my work. I hadn't explicitly stated it until a few months ago, but marriage and children were never in the plan. It began with a laid-back family meal. In her typical fashion, my mother mentioned that I was running out of time. She inquired as to whether I had met anyone noteworthy during my recent return from a vacation to Europe. She started her typical tirade about how I would regret it later when I informed her I wasn't seeking for a relationship at the moment. But this time, I made the decision to quit skirting the issue. I was very clear with her. I never wanted children. The quiet was overwhelming. My mother set down her fork and looked at me as if I had just told her that I was going to Mars. Then the tirade ensued. "I'll regret it when I'm older and lonely," she remarked, calling it selfish. As if he hadn't heard, my dad continued to chop his meal with his head down. Hannah and Adam exchanged glances but remained silent, perhaps expecting it would go away. I made an effort to justify myself by saying that I've never had the same urge toward parenthood, that I value my independence, and that I'm financially secure. My mother, however, wouldn't have it. As the oldest, she began using terms like family duty and carrying on the legacy. At one point, she said that it was my job. At that point, I understood that this was a complete betrayal and not just a difference of opinion for her. After that supper, the weeks were stressful. My mother didn't have to, but she didn't bring it up again. Every time I mentioned a trip or something exciting about my career, she would sigh dramatically and say, "It's a shame you won't have anyone to share it with." She would also say things like, "You'll change your mind when you meet the right person," or "You're just saying that because you're too focused on work." Thanksgiving turned out to be round two, even though I had hoped it would be an opportunity to start over. My mother mentioned over dinner how much she hoped to have grandchildren in the future. After turning to face me, she remarked, "But I guess I can't count on everyone to make that happen." The room fell silent. I requested her to stop talking about it and let her know that I didn't like the remark. She then charged me of destroying the family's heritage. I strongly told her that I wasn't going to apologize because it was my life and my decision. Despite being silent, she gave me that look as if I had pierced her heart. She drew me aside after supper and expressed her inability to comprehend how I could disregard all she had put so much effort into creating. She stated she would be forced to reevaluate my position in the family if I didn't change my opinion. From there, it became worse. She held a family meeting a few days later. She doubled down on everything she'd said, which surprised me because I thought maybe she wanted to clear the air. She warned me that when I was elderly and alone, I would regret betraying her and the family. Hannah shocked me when Adam stood out, stating that it was my life and my choice. She claimed she didn't want to be the only one to continue the family name and said she understood my mom's argument. Next came the rumors. Aunts and cousins began calling me to ask why I was abandoning the family. It was easy to determine that my mother had been speaking. Her ambiguous Facebook status about being betrayed by her own blood was the last straw. Everyone in the family understood exactly who she was referring to, even though she didn't name me. I was finished at that time. I threatened to cut off communication if she didn't respect my boundaries. I could sense the boundaries being formed, and it was obvious that this wasn't going to go away when she responded dramatically, saying, "If you cut me out of your life, don't expect me to keep you in mine." I wasn't going to back down, and she wasn't going to let this go. What began as a private choice had devolved into a family conflict, and I was certain that things would soon get considerably worse. Update 1. I anticipated things would get heated after my mom's Facebook post, but I didn't anticipate how far she would go. She called me a few days later and demanded to have coffee with me. I nodded in the hopes that she would be prepared to engage in a meaningful conversation because she sounded almost too composed. She was sitting with her arms folded when I got there. Initially, she stated that she had given me ample opportunity to reevaluate my childish decision, and that she was unable to tolerate having a daughter who disregarded cultural norms. Then she said something that really got to me. I was no longer a member of the family if I wasn't prepared to change my viewpoint. She stated she had no choice but to shield the family from selfishness because I had made my decision. I was taken aback. She didn't hesitate when I questioned whether she truly wanted to shut me out of her life because of this. She claimed that she couldn't stand by as someone destroyed all she had worked so hard to create. For me, that was it. She was seated there when I got up and left. As I walked away, my hands were shaking, but I didn't turn around. I stopped attending family gatherings after that. The strain and incessant criticism were too much for me to handle. Later that week, Adam texted me to say he would always be there for me and that he thought Mom was being crazy. Hannah, however, had a different reaction. She said over the phone that she could understand Mom's frustration. She made it apparent that she felt I was being obstinate, even though she didn't explicitly urge me to apologize. Adam then informed me that my mother had taken even more step to solidify her disavowal of me by removing me from the family's inheritance and trust. One evening, Adam heard Mom discussing it with my dad, who mentioned that ungrateful children don't deserve family blessings. My dad, as usual, remained silent, but Adam claimed he appeared distressed. That was the last assurance that she was done with me until I caved, and it stung more than the money. After that, I made the decision to stop communicating. I felt somewhat relieved when I muted her on social media and blocked her number. However, the tranquility was short-lived. After a few days, aunts and cousins began contacting me to inquire about what had transpired. My mother had apparently been telling everyone that I had left the family and that she was devastated. I was informed by one cousin that I was selfish beyond repair, and that I would live with regrets for the rest of my life. To keep myself from thinking about it too much, I immersed myself in my work, although it was difficult. My productivity suffered, and I started mentally reliving the previous few weeks. Adam told me he thought the whole thing was absurd when he came over one evening with wine and takeout. He said that I had every right to live my life as I pleased and that Mom was being deceptive. It was a little simpler with him on my side. Nevertheless, I began treatment because the burden of everything was too much. My therapist was excellent. She taught me that I wasn't terrible for setting limits and helped me sort out my guilt. She also emphasized how much of my mother's actions were motivated by control rather than affection. I got insight from that, but it also impacted me hard. Even though it was all agonizing, there was also an odd sense of freedom. I no longer felt the need to defend my decisions to her. I was finally living my life without having to worry about her approval all the time. But the drama didn't stop there. One evening, I received a call from my aunt, who advised me to make amends with my mother before it was too late. She informed me that her mother had been grieving at family meals because she had lost her oldest kid. I assured her quietly that I wasn't the one who broke things off. Mom had to respect my choices and provide an apology if she wanted to make things right. I refused to change my mind, even though my aunt didn't appreciate my response. When my mother threw a lavish family dinner, complete with speeches and tears, to express her grief at the death of her daughter, things reached a new low. As a symbolic gesture, she even placed an empty chair at the table. It was one of the most excruciating lunches Adam had ever experienced, he informed me afterward. He confronted her, telling her that it was not me but her actions that were causing the family to drift apart. She dismissed him, claiming he was incapable of comprehending a mother's pain. Something clicked for me when I realized how far she was willing to go. Emotional manipulation was no longer an option for me. I refused to give in to my mother's desire for control. No matter how much drama she caused, I made the decision right then and there to maintain my limits. Update 2. I hope the silence that followed my exit from that horrible coffee encounter with my parents would last. There were no messages, no calls, and no family ambushes for a long time. I believed that the worst was over, so I concentrated on my career and rehabilitation. After several months, it seemed for a short time that the storm had finally gone. Then, suddenly, my mother contacted me. She said she was prepared to speak in a message. It was brief and clearly not an apology. She mentioned that she missed the old way of life and that she wanted to move on as a family. The advice I received from my therapist, who had been assisting me in getting ready for this kind of situation, was straightforward. Any contact required clear boundaries right away. I cautiously responded, stating unequivocally that I would not put up with any debate on my choice to forego having children. Rebuilding trust, not rehashing previous issues, was the only reason she wanted to communicate. Her answer was courteous, almost courteous. She said that she hoped we could move past everything and that all she wanted was what was best for me. I chose to give her the benefit of the doubt, just for this one time, even though it seemed like she was avoiding accepting accountability for her words and actions. We scheduled a call. It went well at first. She inquired about my job, where I was going, and even a dish she wanted to offer. I briefly believed that perhaps she was sincere about making amends. However, she sneaked in a remark about how I was still young and might change my mind about having children someday, as casually as if she were discussing the weather. I went cold. I reminded her that she was not allowed to discuss this subject. I could hear the sharpness in her voice as she attempted to backtrack, claiming that she was merely having a chat. She had obviously not changed at all. I ended the phone after telling her that I couldn't continue our argument. Adam stopped by to see how I was doing later that night. Hannah had informed him that our mother was upset that I had hung up on her. Adam wasn't shocked. He claimed that ever since the no-contact period started, Mom had been complaining about me to Hannah. Even though he convinced me that I had made the correct decision, it was still quite draining. Hannah phoned me the following day. She stated I was being obstinate by not compromising with Mom, who was attempting to make things better. Although she didn't directly accuse me, it was obvious from her tone that she believed I was to blame for the tension that persisted. As if I were the one sustaining the argument, she insisted that it wasn't fair to place all the strain on Mom. Shortly afterward, my mother resumed her customary behaviors. On Facebook, she shared a mysterious status on the value of family and how some people take their privileges for granted. The timing was clear, even if she didn't specifically mention me. I chose to ignore the encouraging remarks from some of her friends and family, but the drama felt oppressive. One even said, "It's hard when your own kids turn their back on you." My professional life began to suffer as a result of the stress. During meetings, I noticed that I was nodding off and mentally reliving discussions with my mother. It wasn't like me to miss a few deadlines, and even my supervisor saw that I wasn't giving it my all. Despite my best efforts, it was difficult to ignore the weight of everything. My dad arrived at my place a few days later. He told me he was sorry for all that had happened, but he appeared uneasy, as if he didn't want to be there. He claimed that he didn't know how to put things right and that he felt stuck between Mom and me. He acknowledged that he couldn't confront her as doing so would simply exacerbate the situation at home. Although I was grateful for the visit, his detached demeanor was nevertheless annoying. Text was the next strike. I received a note from my mother stating that I would be permanently removed from her will unless I changed my mind. I wasn't even surprised at this point. I replied briefly that I just wanted peace and didn't care about the money. She didn't answer. She seems to have finally given up for a while after that. Adam, however, informed me that she continued to disparage me in front of the broader family. I was told over the phone by my aunt to be the bigger person and call Mom. I reiterated to her what I had been saying to everyone. Any relationship with Mom would need sincere adjustment and consideration for my own space. Talking to a wall felt like that. At that moment, I came to a significant realization. No amount of work on my part would change my mom's behavior, and she would not change until she wanted to. She didn't really listen since she was too preoccupied with appearances and control. I immediately made the decision to cease interacting. More dramatic texts or posts on social media would not be answered by me. She would need to demonstrate her desire to make things better by her deeds rather than her words. Update 3. Shortly after I made the decision to cut off communication with my mother, I had an unexpected knock on my door. My aunt and uncle, who reside approximately 45 minutes away, were there. I was shocked to see them without warning because I hadn't seen them since before the no-contact period began. They quickly got to the point after settling down on my couch. They would come to convince me that, in order to protect the family, I needed to mend my relationship with my mother. My aunt talked about the continuous quarrel that was pulling everyone apart and how much my mom was grieving. My uncle said that it was my duty as the oldest to intervene and broker a settlement. I maintained my composure and clarified that my mother had disowned me, not me, as the reason for the breakup. I informed them that unless she could respect my boundaries, I wouldn't be willing to reopen the door. However, they didn't appear to understand. After an hour or so, they left, obviously annoyed that I wasn't giving up. Adam stopped by with some news a few days later. Since removing me from the trust, it seems that my mother had been moaning to him and Hannah about financial difficulties. She was now concerned about keeping up the family house after making some bad financial mistakes. Adam claimed that she had made it clear that she wanted him and Hannah to contribute to the cost. Although he didn't like it, he didn't want to make things worse by flatly refusing. This was exactly what I had been trying to avoid, so I wasn't shocked. Hannah's animosity toward me, meantime, was become increasingly apparent. She had been complaining to Adam on the phone a lot about being the only responsible child left to handle our parents. She even texted me to say that I needed to stop being so self-centered and that she was sick of taking the brunt of everything. I didn't answer. Then, unexpectedly, I received another communication from my mother. Passive aggressiveness was evident in this one. She wrote about wanting to make amends and how lonely she was, but it was obvious that she hadn't altered her mind. She said that if I could come to my senses and prioritize the family, she would be willing to forgive me. It was just another attempt to control me, not an apology. I didn't respond. I brought up the message at my subsequent therapy appointment. Instead of waiting for my mother to accept responsibility, my therapist advised me to concentrate on achieving inner closure. She suggested it would simply make you more frustrated to expect real change from someone who doesn't realize their own shortcomings. I began working on letting go of the hope that things will ever be different after receiving some sound counsel. However, Adam was still attempting to intervene. He told me that he had spoken to our mother about her actions and that unless she accepted responsibility for her treatment of me, the family would not be able to go forward. However, her reaction was expected. She brushed him off, claiming that I was the one driving the rift and that he didn't comprehend a mother's pain. Despite his frustration, he acknowledged that he had no idea how to approach her. Then the unexpected turn of events occurred. A Facebook post was made by one of my relatives, with whom I hadn't communicated for months. In a lengthy essay, she defended me, criticized my mother's actions, and said it was unreasonable for anyone to expect me to mend something I didn't break. Within our extended family, the post went viral. While some family members supported my mom and said the matter shouldn't have been made public, others applauded her for speaking up. My mom briefly disabled her social media accounts, presumably because the response was too much for her to bear. Adam informed me that, despite the fact that I had nothing to do with it, she was upset over the post and accused me of inciting the family against her. Hannah called again shortly after, but this time she gave an ultimatum. She demanded that I apologize to the family and accused me of creating needless drama. "It's time to put an end to this petty rivalry and quit making things more difficult for everyone," she remarked. I calmly informed her that I would not apologize for my life decisions or for establishing limits. She ended the call. Adam persuaded me to join a family Zoom call, which was when the true surprise happened. After being silent for the majority of this ordeal, my father eventually spoke up. He acknowledged that I withdrew because of my mother's behavior and that her need for control had driven me away. Even though I knew he still wouldn't do anything significant to support me, hearing him say it felt affirming. It was the first time that I felt like I wasn't alone in this. I made the decision to maintain my boundaries. My mother's efforts to control me, blame me, or portray herself as the victim were no longer effective. I had had enough of giving up my tranquility to stroke her ego. I needed this clarity in order to proceed, with or without her. Update 4. One evening, Adam dropped by with some developments I was half anticipating. Our mother's financial difficulties had deteriorated. She had apparently been lamenting to him and Hannah about how difficult it was to keep up the family house. Her direct request for financial assistance caught me off guard. Naturally, she hadn't approached me, she had completely ignored me, but she didn't think twice about making Adam and Hannah feel guilty about how they owed it to the family. Adam wasn't happy, but Hannah took it personally. She had been phoning me all the time and left messages about how I was ignoring my obligations. I chose to ignore the majority of them, but I did respond when she began accusing me of burdening her. I made it clear to her that I would not be getting involved. She had to lie in the bed that Mom had prepared. Hannah wasn't happy about that. She arrived at my door a few days later, enraged. She said that I was being self-centered by letting her and Adam handle everything while I just observed. I maintained my composure and reiterated what I had told her in the messages. Mom made her own decisions, and I wouldn't cross my boundaries to clean up a situation I hadn't caused. Hannah slammed the door behind her and bounded off. My dad called shortly after. I was shocked to see his name on my phone because he seldom ever contacted me on his own. He began by saying he was sorry he hadn't stepped in sooner when I picked him up. He acknowledged that he felt stuck since he didn't want to upset Mom, who had complete financial power. He expressed his understanding of my reasons for withdrawing and expressed the hope that I wouldn't blame him for his inaction. Although it was the most candid discussion we had had in a long time, not much changed. He was still unwilling to confront her. The ambush followed. Hannah persuaded me to attend a family get-together, claiming that everyone needed a respite from the stress and that it would only be a casual supper. I ought to have been more aware. I could sense the tension in the room as soon as I stepped in. At the head of the table, Mom was obviously prepared for a confrontation. The topic of conversation quickly shifted. Mom began to explain about how the family had disintegrated and that if I simply returned, everything would be better. It was obvious that she wanted me to apologize for everything, even though she presented it as a request for forgiveness. I maintained my composure and told her what I had been repeating for months. I would not apologize for the decisions I had made in life, and I would not re-engage with her until she could accept my limits. Hannah lost her temper at that point. She said that since I'd decided to shut everyone off, I had only created drama, accusing me of being cold and self-centered. She slammed the door behind her as she ran out of the room. Adam intervened, spoke up for the first time. He informed Mom that she needed to stop blaming me for everything and that the true problem was her fixation with control. It wasn't well received by Mom. After declaring that I had ruined Christmas, she got up and walked out of the room, tears running down her cheeks. The fallout was as chaotic. Members of my extended family began to voice their opinions, some supporting Mom and some supporting me. Adam later informed me that he had been receiving calls from family who wanted to know why I couldn't simply apologize and put things right. Others contacted out to express their support, such as the relative who stood up for me on Facebook. I worked through everything that had transpired in therapy. According to my therapist, my mother's actions stemmed from her fear of becoming irrelevant and losing power. Although it didn't justify her behavior, it did help me comprehend why she was so resistant to change. I was more resolved than ever to uphold my boundaries after coming to that knowledge. Hannah wasn't talking to me though. She remained silent whenever I tried to check in with her. Despite her refusal to acknowledge it, Adam claimed she was feeling overburdened. She had assumed the position of the responsible child, and she was upset with me for letting her take charge. Mom began to show signs of despair. She accused me of being selfish and callous in a lengthy message. I didn't bother to respond because it was the same old narrative. I chose to concentrate on those who were helping me instead. Adam returned and mentioned that he was thinking about separating from Mom as well. After serving as her sounding board for several months, he had become weary of the ongoing manipulation. For me, that talk marked a sea change. I became aware for the first time that I was no longer lamenting my relationship with my mother. A sense of calm took the place of the grief and guilt that had plagued me for so long. It was sufficient for me to know that I had done everything in my power to uphold my limits while remaining amenable to reconciliation. Regardless of what happened next, I was resolved to keep my peace going ahead. Update 5. Adam called me shortly after the Christmas drama with unexpected news. Mom had been in the hospital for a short time because of health problems brought on by stress. Although it wasn't life-threatening, the family was sufficiently shaken by it. Despite Adam's comment that she appeared pale and exhausted throughout their visit, she continued to talk about how much everything was weighing on her. Hannah called shortly after and insisted that I go see Mom. This was a wake-up call, she said, and I had to put the past behind me for the benefit of the family. I heard but did not back down. I wasn't going to let remorse push me over my limits. I wasn't accountable for Mom's decisions, but stress may have had an impact on her health. Hannah became even more irate when I informed her that I would not be visiting the hospital. Meanwhile, Adam was at the end of his rope. After listening to Mom blame her stress on family disloyalty for hours at the hospital, he eventually had it when she began to pressure him to help mend our relationship. He told her that her need for control was the reason I had left, and he threatened to end our relationship permanently if she didn't examine herself and get help. It wasn't well received by Mom. Adam claimed that although she sobbed and accused him of betraying her, he refused to back down. He was more convinced than ever as he left the hospital that things couldn't go on the way they were. Hannah, however, stepped up her efforts. She said that Adam and I had deserted the family. She claimed that if we had just been more understanding, Mom wouldn't be in this situation and that we were making things more difficult for everyone. Although Adam and I didn't quarrel with her, it was obvious that the gap in the family was only growing. As usual, our father remained impartial. He told Adam that he wished things were different and that he hoped we could find a solution when he saw Mom in the hospital. It was annoying but not surprising that he still refused to adopt a firm stand. Mom was released a week later. At that point, she made direct contact with me. This time, she spoke in a more relaxed, almost contrite tone. She stated that she wanted to try to mend our relationship and was open to the idea of going to therapy. I briefly believed that perhaps she was sincere about wanting to change. I couldn't let my guard down, though, considering everything that had transpired. I hesitantly responded that while I appreciated her attempt, I needed to see consistent behavior before we could get back into contact. Adam supported my choice to hold off. He had been putting more and more distance between them, not returning her calls unless she was prepared to discuss something other than family turmoil. Hannah, meantime, was still struggling to keep everything together. As we both took a step back, Mom was bearing the full burden of our expectations. She refused to acknowledge that she was beginning to sound overwhelmed, according to Adam. I continued to concentrate on my therapy, which was assisting me in overcoming my residual guilt. My therapist urged me to put my health first and give up on the notion that I could resolve the dysfunction in my family. Realizing that I was no longer responsible for the burden was liberating. I got a big promotion at work around the same time. It seemed to be confirmation of everything I had been striving for, evidence that I had succeeded by removing myself from the pandemonium. I felt completely in charge of my life for the first time in years. Adam also made a significant choice. He formally stopped communicating with Mom after months of attempting to mediate. He told me that the incessant deception and guilt trips were too much for him to handle. As a result, Hannah was the only child who continued to speak to her. Although Adam and I felt sorry for her, we also understood that she needed to establish her own limits. It was obvious what Mom would do next. She begged for a family reunion in a lengthy and heartfelt plea. She expressed how much she longed for our reunion and how much she missed the old way of life. I didn't respond. Her remarks sounded hollow since there was no genuine attempt to change them. Then, suddenly, I got a call from Hannah. She acknowledged feeling overburdened and sounded worn out. She stated that she was unsure of how long she could continue to bear things alone. I encouraged her and listened, but I also gently steered her toward thinking about establishing limits with her mother. Although the talk wasn't simple, it seemed like a positive move. At last, I made the decision to write Mom a letter. It was a means of expressing my feelings and establishing clear guidelines for any future relationships, not an attempt to be a kind neighbor. I gave an explanation for my decisions and underlined that respect and improved communication would be the cornerstones of any reconciliation. It felt amazing to share everything with her, even if I wasn't sure if she would actually hear me. I'm now concentrating on going forward. I've surrounded myself with family members and friends who value my identity and are encouraging. For the first time, I feel liberated from the toxic dynamic that hampered me for so long, and the burden of the past is finally fading. Although it's not the conclusion I had hoped for, I needed it.